What's one moment that made you go, that's it, I'm done?
She invited me to that meeting under the pretense of discussing our father's estate, but from the second I walked in, I knew exactly what the script was going to be because my sister has always loved the stage where she could sit in the director's chair and assign everyone else their parts, and for as long as I can remember my part was to sit quietly in the corner, nodding at whatever she decided, swallowing whatever resentment I felt, and pretending I was grateful for crumbs. That day, though, the tone in her voice told me that she wasn't just going to nudge me into the shadows again, she was going to erase me altogether. She didn't bother with small talk, didn't bother asking if I wanted a coffee, didn't even look me in the eye with the faintest courtesy. She opened her folder, spread out papers that she had clearly been rehearsing with for days, and within minutes she dropped the line as if it was a perfectly normal thing for a sibling to say, "You'll get nothing." There wasn't a pause, there wasn't even a glance to see how I would react, because in her mind my reaction didn't matter. She had already written the ending. I sat there, keeping my breathing steady, nodding just enough to let her believe she had me cornered, while inside me something hard and unshakable was settling into place. I was not going to fight her the way she expected. I was going to let her talk herself right into a corner, and when she was done, I would quietly dismantle the little empire she thought she had built on our father's memory. The words stung, of course they did. Imagine giving your whole life to trying to prove you were worth something in a family that kept handing the crown to the other child, and then standing there as that very sister smiled and told you flat out that you were not worth even the leftovers. But I didn't give her that satisfaction. I leaned back, looked at her with the same calm expression I used when customers screamed in my face at work, and thought, go ahead, enjoy yourself, because the more arrogant you get, the more satisfying this will be. She went on, explaining how the house was hers because she had taken care of Dad during his final months, as if paying the occasional visit while the actual nurses handled the hard part was the same as moving heaven and earth to keep him comfortable. She insisted that the bank accounts were hers because she had always managed the family finances, which was a laugh considering the only thing she ever managed was convincing Dad to co-sign loans for things she wanted and then running to him when she couldn't pay them back. She even claimed that the old family land was hers because she valued tradition, though anyone who had ever heard her talk about that land knew the only tradition she cared about was flipping it for profit. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I didn't pull out the receipts of all the months I sat by Dad's bed, spooning broth into his mouth when he couldn't eat on his own, or the endless nights I stayed awake making sure he didn't slip into another coughing fit that would leave him gasping. I let her tell her story, because the thing about my sister is that she thrives on opposition. She wants the fight, because when you fight her, you show her where your weak spots are. So I stayed quiet, and in her mind that meant I was defeated. But the truth was that I had been preparing for this moment ever since Dad first mentioned his will, and though he never showed me the papers, I could hear the hesitation in his voice when he said my sister would handle things. That hesitation told me enough. I had quietly met with a lawyer weeks before, I had quietly gathered what I needed, and I had quietly set the stage so that when she played her little performance, I would know every move before she made it. She thought I came to that meeting to plead for scraps. She thought I came to that meeting unarmed, desperate, maybe a little pathetic. She had no idea that the reason I didn't flinch when she said, "You'll get nothing," was because I was already holding the very thing that would make those words meaningless. When she finally sat back, smug and satisfied, waiting for me to sputter or cry or beg, I simply smiled in a way that must have confused her, because she frowned for the first time that day. I stood, gathered my things slowly, and let her believe that maybe she had broken me, maybe I was retreating. I walked out with her voice echoing in my ears, "You'll get nothing," but what she didn't know was that I had already started writing the ending to the story, and the ending didn't belong to her. Because the moment I left that room, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. And the next time we sat across from each other, she would be the one sitting in silence. When I say that my sister has always believed she was born with a key to every locked door in this family, I am not being dramatic. I am telling you the kind of truth that wears you down year after year until you start measuring yourself by how quietly you can leave a room, because from childhood it was Lauren who got the first slice of anything good and the softest landing from anything bad. While I learned to make peace with the leftovers and heard the same speech every holiday about how she was simply more decisive, more capable, more suited to handle important things, a speech that sounded reasonable if you only listened to the surface and never looked at who actually did the unglamorous work that keeps a life from falling apart. Our father, who was not a cruel man but who loved certainty more than fairness, rewarded whoever looked confident enough to tell him a plan, and because Lauren always had a plan ready, even when it was nothing more than a new way to get what she wanted, he named her the point person for everything with a signature and a deadline, and he told me that my strength was compassion, which sounded kind until I realized compassion was code for doing the thankless tasks without asking questions. By the time our father's health began to slip, the roles were carved so deep that changing them felt like yanking up the flooring in a lived-in house, which meant I took the late calls when the pharmacy made a mistake. I kept the binder of medications and appointments because someone had to track the chaos, and I listened when he admitted he was afraid of being a burden, while Lauren appeared at the comfortable moments with a smile and a promise that she would take care of the important paperwork so he would not have to worry, a promise that impressed him because it sounded firm and adult and efficient, and in those moments I bit my tongue because I knew if I pointed out that the paperwork was only one piece of a very heavy puzzle, he would hear criticism where I was only asking for balance. When he finally named her executor, he said it with the weary relief of a man who thought he was preventing conflict by putting the bossy child in charge, and I nodded because arguing would have turned a difficult day into a fight, and I told myself that the law was the law and fairness would find its way in the end, even though a quiet part of me knew that in families like ours, fairness gets negotiated by whoever holds the pen. So when Lauren sat across from me after the funeral and narrated the estate like a real estate agent with a quota to hit, I recognized the rhythm from 100 smaller scenes. Because she spoke about the house as if calling herself caregiver turned it into her prize, and she labeled the savings as reimbursement for years of emotional labor that she never actually did. And she framed the old lots outside town as sentimental heirlooms only she truly appreciated, even though she had already contacted a developer before the headstone was set, and she tossed out just enough legal language to make the air feel thin, words like probate and power and transfer, as if she had invented them herself and I should be grateful to hear them explained. I did what I have learned to do in rooms where she performs authority, which is to listen longer than feels fair, because if you interrupt her too soon she grows twice as loud and half as careful, and sometimes the most useful thing is to let her keep talking until she reveals the part she meant to hide. In between her lines I heard the same old history beating like a drum, the one where she rushes to the front of the line and then pretends there was no line at all, and I let it play because I needed her confidence to peak. I needed her to say the words that would make what came next not only justified but inevitable, and when she said that I would get nothing, not a keepsake, not a chair, not a page from the photo albums, not even a sliver of the accounts, I watched her face the way you watch a card player who is already counting imaginary winnings, and I felt a steadiness I have never felt with her before. I remembered the nights when I read quiet articles about how executors are supposed to act. I remembered the whispers about our mother's side of the family that Lauren always treated like dead branches on a tree. And I remembered something my father said once about the danger of underestimating the quiet one in the room, a line he probably meant as comfort, but that day it landed like permission. I did not argue with her timeline or her math or her version of caregiving, because I was not there to convince her of my value with another speech that would evaporate the moment she decided the conversation was over. I was there to let her finish tying the bow on a story that would look very different when someone with an actual sense of duty pulled it apart. And as she kept talking, while I nodded in a way that she is always mistaken for surrender, I felt the weight of my purse against my leg and knew with the kind of certainty that settles deeper than anger that I had already brought into that room the one thing she did not prepare for and cannot control. Because beneath the notebook and the tissues and the pen I carry to every appointment, there was a single card with a last name she knows almost as well as her own, and the first time she sees It will be the first time she understands that all her power is borrowed time. Long before my sister called me to that meeting where she spat out her line about me getting nothing, I had already decided that silence was going to be my weapon, and in order for silence to work you need something solid behind it. Something that gives you the patience to let the other person overplay their hand without flinching. So while she was busy arranging papers and memorizing speeches that made her sound like the smartest person in the room, I was quietly sitting in a lawyer's office, with documents spread across the table, listening to someone explain what she was really allowed to do and what she absolutely could not, and realizing for the first time in years that my sister's control only went as far as people allowed it to go. I cannot tell you how strange it felt to sit across from a professional who looked me straight in the eye and said, "You have rights here, you have more power than you think, and if you want to use it, you need to stop arguing with your sister at her level and start preparing at yours," because that was the moment I knew I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to flip the script completely. The lawyer's name was Lena Myers, and the second she handed me her card I stared at that last name longer than I should have, because Myers was my mother's maiden name, and though I had not heard it spoken in years, the memory of whispered arguments between my parents about my mother's estranged family came rushing back. The kind of family stories children are never given the full truth about, but are expected to piece together from fragments and silences. Lena explained that she was the daughter of my mother's sister, which technically made her my cousin, though we had never been close because our mothers stopped speaking long before we were old enough to understand what grudges were being carried. Still, the blood connection meant something, not just to me but to the woman sitting across from me explaining estate law with a calm confidence that made me feel like for once someone was willing to stand beside me instead of standing over me. And when I thought about how Lauren would react to seeing that last name in print, knowing the complicated history attached to it, I realized it was the perfect storm of personal and professional power. Over the weeks leading up to the confrontation, Lena walked me through every detail of what an executor can and cannot do. She highlighted where my father's intentions might have been twisted into something else. And she assured me that just because Lauren spoke with authority did not mean she was acting with authority. I gathered copies of medical records that showed who had actually been present for Dad during his worst days. I tracked down old emails where Dad mentioned fairness in dividing things. And I quietly learned how every action Lauren bragged about could be scrutinized under the light of responsibility. It wasn't about building a courtroom battle just yet. It was about arming myself with knowledge so that when Lauren expected me to collapse at the sound of her voice, I would instead smile at the sound of her mistakes. The hardest part was keeping my mouth shut around her, because there were so many moments when I wanted to blurt out that she was not nearly as clever as she thought, but Lena told me that patience would pay more than pride, and she was right. Because nothing rattles someone like Lauren more than a sister who doesn't rise to the bait, who just sits there listening and nodding as if defeated while secretly holding the key to the entire game. So when the day of the so-called meeting arrived and Lauren ran through her list of self-serving justifications, I stayed exactly as calm as Lena had trained me to be, waiting for the exact line that mattered most. And when it came, when she leaned forward, eyes gleaming, and told me with absolute certainty that I would get nothing, I reached into my bag, pulled out the card I had been carrying for weeks, and slid it across the table with a steadiness that surprised even me. She frowned, probably expecting some desperate plea scribbled on paper, but the second her eyes fell on the printed name, her mouth froze just slightly, enough for me to know that recognition hit her before she could cover it. For the first time in my life, I felt her confidence falter, and that tiny crack was all I needed, because now the silence belonged to me, and she knew it. The moment I slid the card across the polished surface of the table, I could see in my sister's expression a flicker of confusion, the kind that creeps in when someone who has spent their entire life believing they control the script suddenly finds an unexpected line written in handwriting they do not recognize. And she stared at the white rectangle as though it were just another piece of paper until her eyes landed on the name, and then her whole posture shifted, because the name Myers carried weight she did not want to acknowledge, not in this house, not in front of me, and certainly not after announcing with such arrogance that I would walk away with nothing. She had always believed that family silence could be treated like a graveyard, something you don't speak of, and therefore something that can no longer hurt you. But that last name dragged up an entire history that our parents had buried so deep she thought it had decomposed. And the fact that I was the one holding it forced her to sit there, for once in her life, without a rehearsed speech. Her lips parted slightly as though a protest was about to form, but then she closed them again, and I knew right then that the silence was more valuable than any argument I could have prepared, because silence from Lauren was an earthquake, a sign that her confidence had finally cracked, and she did not know how to rebuild it in front of me. I leaned back in my chair, deliberately calm, not smug, not explosive, just steady, because I wanted her to feel every second of that shift in power, and I wanted her to know that this time I had not walked into the room to fight on her terms. I had walked in ready to burn the script she had written and replace it with my own. The card itself was simple, embossed letters, no dramatic design, no flourish, but the name alone was enough to carry the kind of weight she could not laugh off, because Lena was not just any lawyer, she was blood, she was family. She was the side of family Lauren had dismissed her whole life, and the thought of that bloodline stepping back into the picture, not as estranged relatives, but as legal counsel with every right to scrutinize her actions, made her face pale in a way I had never seen. She tried to straighten her shoulders, to summon her usual lecture voice, the one she used on me and even on our father when she wanted him to back down, but the words stumbled, and all she managed to say was a weak, "You can't be serious," which I answered not with words, but with the quietest of smiles, because this was not about arguing anymore. This was about letting her realize that every move she had made was about to be watched by someone who not only knew the law but knew the family well. Enough to smell her lies. I watched her glance at the card again, and I could practically hear the calculations in her mind, the way she was trying to work out how much I knew, how much Lena had told me, and how many of her so-called victories could unravel if even half of what she had claimed was challenged by someone with the authority to demand proof. In the silence that filled the room, the weight shifted completely, because for the first time in decades she was not the unquestioned authority, she was the one who had to second-guess, and the taste of her uncertainty was sweeter than any speech I could have delivered. I let the pause stretch, long enough for her to sweat, long enough for her to realize that she had been outmaneuvered, and then I stood, gathered my things, and told her, with a tone so measured it must have unnerved her, that I would let my lawyer handle all further communication, which was my way of saying that her reign was officially over, that her little empire of intimidation had collapsed in the span of seconds, and she could not salvage it by raising her voice or slamming her fist on the table. As I reached the door, I turned just enough to see her still staring at that card, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to drag herself back into control, but all she could manage was silence. And that silence was worth more to me than any inheritance could ever buy. For once in our lives, she was the one speechless, and I was the one walking away with the certainty that the fight was no longer hers to dictate, because the next round would not be played at her table, under her rules, or with her smug little smirk leading the way. The next round would be on my terms, with my lawyer, carrying a last name she could never erase, and I could not wait to watch her learn what it felt like to be the one cornered. In the days that followed that meeting, there was an almost eerie quiet between my sister and me, a quiet that spoke louder than any shouting match we had ever had, because she knew, and I knew, that the game she had been running for years was finally slipping out of her hands, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. For once she did not flood me with calls, she did not send condescending emails laced with threats disguised as advice, and she did not try to corner me into a hallway conversation the way she had done so many times before. Because she understood that now she was no longer dealing with a little sister who would eventually cave out of exhaustion, but with someone who had learned that power isn't about the loudest voice in the room. It is about having the patience to wait for the exact moment, when silence becomes the sharpest weapon. I went about my life as though nothing had happened, working my shifts, paying my bills, and refusing to let her see a single crack in my composure, while behind the scenes, Lena moved deliberately, sending letters that carried the full weight of the law, requesting documents, filing motions and reminding Lauren that being executor was not the same as being queen. When the legal process began to unfold, my sister tried one last time to regain her footing, showing up with the same smug posture, waving around papers that she thought could scare me. But the moment Lena's voice cut through the room with the kind of confidence only someone carrying both blood and law can possess, I watched Lauren shrink in real time. Because she realized that every claim she had made so casually in front of me would now have to stand in front of someone who was not intimidated by her rehearsed speeches. I did not need to interrupt. I did not need to argue, because Lena did exactly what I had hoped she would, dismantling Lauren's false narrative piece by piece, exposing the gaps, and reminding her that arrogance does not substitute for evidence. I sat there in that office with a calmness I had never known, not because the process was easy, but because the tables had finally turned so completely that for once it was Lauren who had to scramble for answers, and every time she stumbled, I felt a surge of quiet justice that no jury in the world could have delivered better. The eventual outcome was not dramatic in the way television likes to show courtroom victories. There was no gavel slam, no gasps from the crowd, just the steady and undeniable reality that the estate had to be divided fairly. That every attempt she had made to shut me out was now meaningless, and that her title of executor had become nothing more than a set of obligations she could not twist to her advantage. The house, the accounts, the land, everything she once declared as hers alone, was now legally forced into balance, and though I did not walk away with everything, I walked away with something much more valuable than numbers on a page. I walked away with proof that her dominance was not inevitable, that her version of reality was not permanent, and that I was capable of breaking free from the role she had written for me since childhood. Watching her face as she signed papers she never wanted to acknowledge was the kind of victory that doesn't need applause, because it was written in every line of her expression, in every pause before she put pen to paper, in every sigh that slipped out when she realized she could not bend the system to her will this time. And when it was all done, when the dust finally settled, she tried to summon the energy to deliver some final line, some bitter comment that could let her feel she had the last word. But the truth was she didn't have one, not anymore, because her silence spoke louder than any insult ever could. I looked at her across that room, and instead of anger or gloating, I felt a strange and steady peace, because I had proven to myself that justice does not always come with shouting or with fists on the table. It comes when you are willing to be underestimated long enough to let the other person write their own downfall. She had invited me to that first meeting only to humiliate me with the words, "You'll get nothing," but as I walked out of that final room with the documents in hand and my head higher than it had ever been, I knew that I had walked away with everything that mattered. Not just the fair share of an estate, but the dignity of knowing that her power over me had ended, and that I would never again be the quiet sister sitting in the corner waiting for her approval. She had wanted me small, invisible, grateful for crumbs, but what she got instead was the shock of watching the sister she dismissed rise with a lawyer's card carrying a name she could not ignore. A name that tied our past to her present and reminded her that she was not untouchable. And that, more than the house or the accounts or the land, was the real inheritance I claimed, the knowledge that silence, patience, and the right moment can dismantle decades of control in a single, unforgettable move.